the Lord does not hesitate to talk about what we need to do with our money. In fact, somebody went through and said that 70% of his parables are about what we do with our resources, what we do with our money, what we, and so. But what's important to understand is that how we deal with our resources, our financial resources, is not simply a worldly matter. It's not simply something that belongs outside the doors of the temple, because it's fundamentally a spiritual issue. How we deal with our money, how we deal with our finances, is precisely a spiritual issue, and it's all about our spiritual life. In the case of this gospel reading, you have two debtors. Now, they're talking in terms of talents and pences. Well, a talent, I think, was 1,000 pence. Okay? In other words, it's about 3 years' salary. If a pence was a day's wage, okay, a talent was 3 years' salary. The first debtor came to his master, to the king, who owed him 10,000 talents. This is like $10 million in reality. And in those days, it was like $10 million. And the king was ready to have him thrown in jail. You can imagine Donald Trump, but the king was ready to have him thrown in jail until he paid his debt. We don't do that anymore, supposedly. But he begged the king and said, "Be patient, and I'll pay you." And so the king wasn't just patient; he actually forgave him the debt. And then this guy came up to him who owed him $100. $100. Actually, probably $1,000 in today's, because it was 3 weeks' salary. And instead of forgiving him, as he had been forgiven, he sent him off to the debtor's prison to have him sold into slavery, to have the debt paid. Now, one aspect of this, and certainly kind of the major aspect of this teaching of our Lord in the Gospel, is summed up in that final verse of the pericope of the passage. So that if you don't forgive your brother from your heart, neither will you be forgiven. And I think one of the things that's important to understand is that we have been given so much by God. Think of all of the incredible gifts that God has given to you. He's given to your life, your family, all of the abilities that you have, all of the resources that you have. It all comes from God. Of course, in America, we like to say, "Oh, I worked for it all and I made it all." But still, it's all a gift of God's providence. Yes, it comes by hard work. But it's still a gift of God's providence. There's lots of people who work real hard and don't do very well. But whether you've got millions of dollars or whatever you have, we have to give thanks to God for all of the things that He has given to us, for the resources that He has given to us. And He calls us to lend freely, without expecting repayment. Now, that's not good business. But sometimes the gospel isn't really good business. When He tells you don't expect repayment, He's not only saying don't expect interest. He's saying don't expect your principal back. Because what does God expect of us? He puts everything that we have into our stewardship for us to use for the sake of the upbuilding of His kingdom. There's a basic kind of rule that goes around the Christian world, that the basic contribution to the church is a tithe. And that's based on the Old Testament. Well, that's Old Testament. In Christianity, in the New Covenant, remember in Ananias and Sapphira, it's not about 10%. It's about 100%. It all belongs to God because it all came from God. And so we are stewards of the resources that He gave to us. And so if we have lent to somebody and they can't repay, we shouldn't get angry. We should be able to forgive. Now, the gospel reading is about somebody who was forgiven so much materially and was so overcome with himself that he couldn't forgive a little bit. He couldn't even forgive a little bit and destroyed this other man's life because he couldn't forgive. How often are we like that? How often are we selfish? How often do we refuse to forgive? Maybe it's not about $10 million, or maybe it's not about $100, a loan that you give a friend. Maybe it's about something that you were offended at. Maybe it's about something somebody else did that you didn't like. Do we do things that other people don't like? Yes. Does God forgive us? Yes. So why don't we forgive our friends and our neighbors? This is cutting to the real core, I think, of this gospel teaching today. That we have to forgive our brethren, our neighbors, everything, and live in a state of constant forgiveness. And what is that state of forgiveness? It's openness to the other. When we refuse to forgive somebody, what do? We close ourselves off. And basically say, unless you give me back X number of bucks, or unless you give me, unless you apologize, or unless you do so and so, I'm not going to talk to you. There's no place for that in the church. There's no place for that among Christians. We hold resentments, we have all of these things which we hold against other people. And we forget that God has forgiven us. We forget that God showers His grace and His mercy and His love upon us, no matter how bad we've been, and no matter how completely we have ignored Him. So, brothers and sisters, let's take into our hearts and into our minds this admonition from the Lord, that unless we forgive our brothers and sisters from our heart, we will not be forgiven. And if we do, then we enter into that great flow of God's will, that great flow of His grace. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. The blessing of the Lord be upon you through His grace and love for mankind, always, now and ever, and unto ages of ages. Amen.